This episode was recorded just days before the passing of former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who among his many accomplishments is remembered for working to advance Métis rights, particularly self-government. Mulroney commissioned the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, believing in the importance of working meaningfully with Canada's Indigenous peoples. Mulroney played a central role in the constitutional negotiations from which our opening quote by Métis leader Jim Sinclair is taken.
We have the right to self-government, to self-determination of land. And the people that are here are going to go back and continue the struggle. This is not an end, it's only a beginning.
Hello, and welcome to the True Canadians podcast. From the book by the same name, I'm David Wylynko, your host, and I co-wrote the book with Patricia Russell, Métis writer. We are here today with Anthony Wilson-Smith in Toronto at Historica Canada. Anthony is the CEO and president. Welcome, Anthony.
Hey, David. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So we start this podcast with this quote from Sinclair from the constitutional negotiations in the 1980s. And it was one of the monumental moments for the Métis. It was shortly after the Constitution Act of 1982, which sort of brought the Métis, along with the Inuit and the First Nations, into the modern Canada. Trudeau was busy, and Jean Chrétien, his minister, getting the Constitution for Canada. But along the way, Jim Sinclair and others were saying, "Hey, what about us?" So I want to talk to you a bit about that because I think you might have some firsthand knowledge to share with us. But before we do that, a lot of our listeners might not be as aware as many other Canadians are of your personal career and your history and all the things you've done. So let's talk about you for a minute. Where are you from, and how did you get into journalism and eventually come to Historica Canada?
Yeah, I'll try to give you the condensed version, David. So always wanted to be a journalist. Started in high school, worked my way through university 2.5 days a week at a local newspaper, doing everything there in Montreal. Got onto the Gazette from my third year of university and skipped the final year for a long time, and then went to Quebec City, covered National Assembly and politics across the province. For the Gazette, went to Maclean's shortly after, where I spent the next 20 years, alternately in Montreal and Quebec City, overseas in Moscow for 3 years, and then in Ottawa and Toronto, and finally as editor-in-chief for about 4 years and a bit, until I finally thought, I've loved journalism, time for something else. And then I did communication stuff for a while and settled in, and I've been here corporately, and I've been here at Historica Canada for a little over 10 years now.
I forget exactly what the timeline was, but I do recall, I believe you had a column in Maclean's, right near the beginning, maybe page 3. I don't know if that was the same time that the revered writer Alan Fotheringham had a column on the back, I believe. But I remember opening Maclean's magazine. I think as a journalism student, I'd read your column and I'd read his column, and then I'd decide whether or not I was going to be able to read anything in between if I had time. That old famous saying that people always look at the front and the back of the book, So Maclean's was brilliant the way that they'd bookend you and Alan. But Historica Canada, it's really well known across Canada. You've got this great Heritage Minute, and congratulations on your latest one, Norman Kwong. Maybe tell us about that for a second. You just brought it out in Calgary, is that right?
Yeah, we try to do, people often ask where the ideas for minutes come from. One of the things I always say is we follow an impossible mandate, which is we try to make enough minutes so that everybody in Canada, whoever they are, can look at them and say, hey, I see myself in that, or identify that in some way. So we look at specific groups, and we had never done anything on the Canadian Football League before, and we had never done anything specifically on a prominent Chinese-Canadian athlete in particular before. So Norman Kwong was both. He was a terrific football player in the 50s into the 60s with Edmonton and Calgary both, and he had a great business career after, where he went off and he was president of the Calgary Flames when they won their only Stanley Cup, and finally lieutenant governor of Alberta. So a great Canadian success story from someone who faced very difficult times, a Chinese Canadian, when there's still the Chinese head tax, a lot of overt discrimination towards Chinese people. So it shows you both the warts and flaws of the country, but also how really good people transcend that and create their own opportunity.
When you mention about the, racism, and here in Canada, we like to be thought of as, the really good people go in the world. There's this famous story, about Americans wearing Canadian flags on their backpacks when they travel to Europe and elsewhere. But we have our own, sordid stories, our skeletons in the closet. And for the Métis, who we're talking about today, that would be about the residential schools. And Historica Canada has a story about that. I read it earlier today. And just recently, the Pope came to visit, where he actually made an apology for the residential schools. And then when he was on the plane back, he actually used the word genocide, which was picked up a little bit by the media, but I think it surprised a lot of people. There seems to have been, and this came out of, by the way, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Murray Sinclair was the chair of that. He's now Chancellor of Queens, I believe. He's from Winnipeg, as am I. That came out of the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. So there's been this progression over years, maybe a decade or more. Historica Canada, it seems, contrary to a lot of historical accounts that we've read, that we read about in school. I read Challenge and Survival in high school, and it was 3 pages about the Métis, even though I grew up in Fort Garry, just down the road from the original Fort Garry that Louis Riel occupied in 1869. Tell us a little bit about the mandate of Historica Canada and what the organization is doing, which I think is well known to be the case, to sort of change the way people are thinking about our history here.
Some people complain and say modern history, rethinking of incidents, is rewriting history. I don't agree at all. And, David, you've been a journalist, and so was I. I think we can agree that the best story is the most complete story, where you talk to the most people possible. Well, the fact is that for a lot of Canada's history, nobody bothered talking to the Indigenous peoples and saying, hey, what about it? What's your version? And I've always been struck by, there's a particularly memorable Murray Sinclair quote from a couple of years back, which we've used in one of our educational tools for schools, where he said, people, meaning non-Indigenous people always come to me and say, why can't you just forget it all? And I always say to them, why can't you just remember? And that's like a boom, when you hear it. Like, that's got, then you start thinking, yeah, let's really get to know this. And there's also the issue that, a deal is a deal is a deal.
Interesting you mentioned, Anthony, about a deal is a deal is a deal, because as I was, sort of somewhat comically describing with the cartoon that we had used for the book, which was taken from an actual cartoon that by a Métis lawyer, Jason Madden, who has been another guest on our podcast series, that he used to try to convey to, non-Métis or so-called colonial Canadians about this issue of the Métis. And, the same goes for First Nations and Inuit, which Historica Canada has written about as well. Being promised things, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Jason calls it the legal lacuna, which just means gap. Mm-hmm. The gap being the lack of Métis recognition, First Nations facing the same issues. Historica Canada, are there any sort of projects that come to mind, or any initiatives, or themes that your organization has delved into that related to this that you think is useful for our listeners to know about, or maybe to research?
Yeah, first, so we're very much an education-focused organization as opposed to advocacy. So we try to just lay things out there and let people draw their own conclusions. And when you do that, in the case of a lot of Indigenous, and including, of course, Métis issues, the story kind of tells itself. So we are very much believers in the overall Indigenous principle of nothing about us without us. In other words, let's make sure that every story that we do has the direct participation of people who are involved and who have a first-hand story. The problem, again, with a lot of Canadian history traditionally has been that point of view wasn't even solicited, never mind heard. It's not as though it was people spoke up and were ignored. They didn't really get a chance to speak up. So we've done a number of, you referred earlier, we have a Heritage Minute on residential schools, a very difficult story, as it has to be, a very painful story of Chani Wenjack, who died running away from one because of ill treatment. We have a very successful Indigenous learning guide, where we worked with all sorts of experts from various communities on, and we distribute that to schools. We have a network of about 12 to 14,000 teachers who we reach individually, so a lot of material gets out there. We've done one on treaties. And then in the overall Indigenous front, we just did a very, very successful, meaning very popular one a couple of years ago on the great world champion runner and World War I hero, Tom Longboat, who in the First World War who served as a runner in the front lines, but also won the Boston Marathon and a bunch of other awards. And then we know there's a long history, of course, of Indigenous military heroes, Tommy Prince and others, and we have those stories too. So, but the encyclopedia is really the vehicle where we do most of this. And it has about 15 million unique users a year, so it's very widely used. And we make a point of making sure that citations and things are kept up to speed. We have 6 full-time editors, almost all in the postgraduate degrees, and they work again with people from respective communities, so that we have 4 different forms of academic citation. So these are pieces which can be used in postgrad works as well. In other words, we're searching the highest degree of authenticity we can get. And because we're all online now, as opposed to the old books, we can update as we go. And we do. So not to go too much further, but one thing we did specifically in our history of Métis is As you know, of course, there are different definitions of what constitutes Métis organizationally, legally, and otherwise. So we actually commissioned, in this case, a couple of contrarian opinion pieces saying, okay, here's one point of view, here's another point of view, just so that, readers like myself, frankly, can then read it and say, okay, I see this perspective, now I see this, and now I'm going to read some more. We try to open a door to get people to walk through and learn more.
That's great. So on that point, I'm going to ask you if you feel that there is an evolution occurring in perceptions, and if you want to branch it out and speak about Inuit and First Nations as well, feel free. But I'll preface it by saying that Patricia, my co-author, and I on the book, we did a cross-Canada tour, and we were rather impressed. We were here in Toronto. Heather Reisman actually joined us for a while at our event in Toronto at the Indigo up the street. We went all the way to Halifax, where we were interviewed on Global News, and the young fellow said to us, why are you here? I mean, and we said, well, if Canada is going to be a national country from coast to coast to coast and to the U.S. border, then it should encompass all the things that make up Canada across the entire country. That's probably something that someone like Pierre Trudeau would have been fond of thinking or saying. When we went to Vancouver and when we were in Winnipeg, we had a largely non-Métis audiences of as much as 100 people come to our events. So we were encouraged by that. And now we're going to talk a bit about this legislation when we talk more about Sinclair. But in your view, given the work that Historica Canada has done, and you talk to a lot of people that are involved in this kind of work, has there been an evolution in thinking? Are people evolving in the way that they perceive Métis and First Nations and Inuit? They're so-called, the real founding people of this country.
Yeah, the attitude previously, when it was anything at all, when, if you ask people for a long time, what did they think of Indigenous issues or whatever the word they use for Indigenous, the real answer would be that people probably didn't think at all. They just didn't. It was at a distance. It was not something that was considered. And then there was kind of a first step of evolution, which was to look at everything in a maternal or paternal way. In other words, we're going to tell them what's good for them. And that reflects through a lot of history, that idea that these are, the savage, the this, the something we have to, The original idea of residential schools, of course, was let's make them like us. Now you find a situation where people are grappling with the consequence, I think, of saying, okay, we have to do something about this. We understand that we've failed in this area. How do we make it better? And that's running head on into, okay, what are the consequences for me going to be, whoever you are? And that's what causes a lot of delays. It's kind of like everybody's in favor of equality until it's in their backyard, and it means suddenly I may not have certain, claims over something I thought I did before. But I'll tell you the upside part is, my sort of part-time job is that I chair the Canada Post Committee, the Stamp Advisory Committee, which decides what will go on a postage stamp, and it's a very complex process. So several years ago, and this was not my initiative, it was the corporations. They said, let's start recognizing more of Indigenous history as well. That was the first step, very big one for the corporation. And then the next step was, well, if we're going to do this, they should be the ones telling us how it's going to be. So there are now stamps coming out every year, which was the full engagement of staff brought on, of experts brought on from various communities, including when I was, president, engaged in discussions on several years ago on Métis as well. So, again, it's about going and saying, okay, let's hear what you think, because this is about you.
Mm-hmm. In the book, I looked at, and this is a little bit difficult, maybe. I mentioned earlier about, Challenge and Survival, the high school book that I studied. It was written by 3 Winnipeg high school teachers. I actually, true disclosure, still have my copy. I swiped it. I didn't want to give it up. I've used it ever since. But there's a lot of popular historical accounts going up to not even that recently, as recently as 2014, that either don't talk about Métis, or, which is almost like a negation in itself of history in Canada, or we continue to talk about them sort of in a not so flattering, almost derogatory way. There is a more recent historian, Margaret Conrad in particular, who's written more recently about Canadian history. I think she's retired now, but
yeah.
And it's like she's looking at the same material. So she'd be looking at what Riel's was trying to achieve and what Johnny MacDonald was trying to achieve. She looked at the same material and interpreted it in a different way. And so I'm intrigued by your idea about, are Canadians ready to accept that perspective and ready to accept what would be the consequences for them if we were to actually implement this in a way that means something, which the legislation we're about to talk to, does. C-92, for example, and upholding of at the Supreme Court a week or so ago. In Alberta, where this really becomes relevant is in hunting, is in harvesting rights, which the Métis still don't have in southern Alberta. they do have it in central and northern Alberta, but in southern Alberta, there's still a debate about, well, were the Métis ever here? And my view on that was, well, can you show me your forefathers' address in southern Alberta from the 1850s? So not really a question here so much as just, what do you think is there still quite an uphill battle, to be mounted here on this matter?
Yeah, it depends on area too. For example, the land claims issues where oil exploration or oil development things have come up, of course, are very contentious. Who owns it? Who will agree? How much environmental consultation should there be? Yeah, the base is something I would say about history in general, David, which is an event only happens once, but it can be interpreted countless different ways. So, of course, for Indigenous issues for years, the interpretations were always from the non-Indigenous side, and now going up and saying, well, actually, okay, so you have a say in this, you have a right. And the Métis story is funny, of course, because the Métis in many ways, both credit to them and unfortunately for them, is the history of Canada, really. It's the intermingling of those who came here with those who are already here. It's the shared cultures within. It's the use of language, which constitutes elements of French and their own ones within. It's the divisions between English and French that have occurred in the Métis communities themselves, the religious issues, the land issues tied into it, who belongs here, who does not. Well, I mean, the claim is quite endless. And then there is as I said, the sort of the wish to homogenize when, so we have a great hero here who's Métis. Well, they're kind of really one of us, aren't they? Whereas that villain over there, no, we don't want them. So they don't really belong here. And that's, you have to pick through that.
It's interesting when you say about oil, because there is actually a consortium that the Métis are part of out west in an effort to purchase the Trans Mountain pipeline, which has been very controversial for environmental reasons, among others, very costly. It's a sort of an example where Canadians will need to come to terms with, this fact that in addition to recognition and reconciliation, and I don't know what the right word would be, but there's going to be a desire for ownership and direct participation in the Canadian economy, especially the natural resource area of that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more on the other side, along with Sinclair and some of this legislation. We're talking with Anthony Wilson-Smith, the CEO and President of Historica Canada. We'll be right back.
Hello, this is Audrey Patra. Métis history, in my opinion, is something that we all need to understand. As a young person, I believe that everyone would know about Métis history, or everyone would at least understand that the Indigenous people in this country, as per the Constitution Act of 1982, is Indians, Inuit, and Métis. So with that, believing that everyone would know who we were. But I learned very quickly that education needed to happen. I was actually very surprised that people who I considered had gotten into positions, high positions within society, would not even understand who we were. And of course, looking at that, you look at all the books that are out there, written by many different authors. So I guess when I think about that, it makes you believe everyone had a different opinion of who those Métis were. Some we didn't exist. Some we were the same as Indian people. So we learned very, very quickly that one of the things we needed to do was educate. And I am very pleased to see that now we do see stories, whether that's in magazines, whether that's actually books that people are more recently writing, or factual documents about who the Métis are. But it was very difficult at the beginning of my time as the president of the Métis Nation to sit at a table and realize that we needed to educate. But we learned, and we said, okay, if people don't know, it's time to tell them who we are. And that's where we began actually producing documents. Rupert's Land Institute has done an amazing job of producing information for universities, for colleges, for schools, trying to educate everyone about who we are as Métis. And what I do believe is Métis history is becoming one of those topics that I believe people are beginning to be interested in wanting to know about. And of course, that is really, really important for us as Métis people, as we talk about reconciliation and legislation, it is important for people to understand the actual history of what went on in this country, where we as Métis people were very big contributors to the history of this country. And that's what people need to understand.
So we're back with Anthony Wilson-Smith, the President and CEO of Historica Canada here in Toronto. Anthony, that little clip that we have at the beginning of our podcast of Jim Sinclair, a Métis hero, speaking at the First Nations Conference on Aboriginal Rights, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and the premiers, was quite a dynamic moment for the Métis, and from their perspective, pretty seminal, especially coming just 5 years after the 1982 Constitution Act, which recognized the rights of the Métis and the First Nations and the Inuit, and that itself, Section 35 of that act, has led to a whole series of other things that we talked about with Jason Madden, culminating in certain legislation that's before the federal government, before Parliament right now. But maybe you could share with us from your perspective as a practicing journalist, back in the day, as they say, what was that like at that time? Mulroney held a whole series of negotiations. It was like it was on every night. The Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accord, and share us a little bit of the color of that whole experience, and if you can, what if anything, those negotiators were thinking about the Métis and the First Nations at the time.
Yeah, I think the thing is, David, that the answer is, as I said about something earlier, is that what were they thinking about Indigenous and Métis? They weren't. Brian Mulroney's focus going into Meech Lake was he wanted Quebec to sign the Constitution, which of course they had not in 1982, with, quote, honor and dignity. And that was the entire focus of it. So they were listening very carefully to Quebec, and they weren't listening at all to the other voices, just not hearing it. I think if you talk to Mr. Mulroney now, as I would say, as I actually do occasionally still, he would say, I saw this as a two-track policy, that we would resolve Quebec first because that was a huge hole, and then we would deal with the other. Well, then, of course, Indigenous leaders and Métis leaders were saying, we're not having it. Like, we've been around for these many hundreds of years. We want in on it too. There was an interesting comment also from Robert Bourassa, who I knew well, of course, the Quebec Premier then. And I said to him before and talked to him again after and said, well, you keep saying even if you sign Meech, you're going to push for more constitutional powers for Quebec even after the agreements. So what's the point? Why should the rest of Canada care if you're just going to be the same? And his answer applies to Indigenous leaders as well. He said, the difference is you can conduct negotiations in goodwill and in trust of the other side, or you can go into them saying, I think you're just out to mess me up and you're just looking to cut my throat on everything you possibly can. So that's the view that's really defined Quebec's dealings with the rest of the country for much of the years since the failure of the Accord in 1988. And I think you could look at this and say, Indigenous leaders similarly look and say, all right, so we have about 400 years of signing treaties with you, some of which you pay no attention to at all, others of which nominally, and finally you're honoring some. So tell me what's my trust point in this? And that affects the tone of negotiations in anything when you go in.
How could it possibly come about in 1987? And I know Brian Mulroney was a big picture prime minister, and he had a lot of ideas, a lot like his predecessor, Pierre Trudeau, maybe not agreeing on things, but certainly, I want to get big things done kind of a role as prime minister. How could a First Ministers Conference on Aboriginal rights even occur when there was all this other stuff going on that he was trying to get done in a very, very short time span?
Yeah, and his focus, he was the guy from Bécomo, a small town in Quebec, and that was the experience he'd lived all his life, including the disappointment over, coming close. And even Sobertists were disappointed when there was actually no agreement with the rest of the country. So that was his starting point was, I got to do this. This is what I'm here for, and then I'm going to get to the rest. It's funny to look back now because, we're shaped by all the events since then, but at the time it seemed quite logical. And, again, well, I do think it's colored the approach to Quebec and Quebec's approach to the rest of the country since. That's a different issue, and I think it's been a very negative, unfortunate one. But you also see this, people honestly in the 1980s, late 1980s, still weren't even really saying, hey, what are we going to do about Indigenous issues? And that's a big thing we're seeing tracking. And I found Meech personally to be disappointment being from Quebec myself, but I also understand that this was the point at which leaders stood up and said, come on, let's go, let's get this done. And that was important.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when I was, working as a cub reporter at that time, we didn't think about the relevance of Meech Lake or Charlottetown to Indigenous peoples or the Métis, certainly, or the Inuit. at all, because as you point out, so much of the oxygen was being sucked up by, the Quebec question and, national unity as it applied to, the South across all of our major urban areas. And we weren't thinking a lot as much. I mean, it probably, was there anything, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but I think about the Kelowna Accord and Paul Martin, who since subsequently, after being Prime Minister, has gone on to champion an organization that pursues Indigenous rights and achievements with his personal foundation, not his own foundation, but a foundation, the Martin Family Foundation, I think it's called. Was there any major steps between 87 and the Kelowna Accord, which subsequently was quashed, that made progress for the Métis or the First Nations that occurs to you?
Well, first, I'm very glad you mentioned Paul Martin, because he is passionately devoted. Absolutely. It's one of the most important issues in his life is advancing Indigenous causes. And I saw him in the fall of 2022. We spent about 2 hours together at his office. I'd go back a long way with him. And almost all of our conversation was him talking about the importance of initiatives, about creating opportunities, because he also pointed out that, how, for example, can you expect to have Indigenous-run businesses if you've never given young Indigenous people the opportunities to learn how to lead and how to do these basic principles? They're smart enough, but if you don't give them the tools, how can they do the job? So a lot of his work since then has been about that. He was, I would say, far and away the most devoted, concerned on Indigenous issues of any of the Prime Ministers since. And that's no disrespect to Mr. Harper, who made some efforts to move things along in recognition terms, to all of the others since. But he would say that he saw the Kelowna Accord, it was going to be the most important achievement in his view, that he succeeded, period, in a very successful thing. And his disappointment, the revocation or not happening was certainly the most profound disappointment. To some degree, even more so than not being Prime Minister for all that long. If that had lived through, he would have been happy.
That was quite a controversy. I don't know how many of our listeners would be aware as much as you would be about the whole Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin fiasco, the infighting that occurs with the Liberal Party, and I guess maybe any political party from time to time. But after Paul Martin was Prime Minister, he set up the foundation. He actually provided the foreword to our book. He very graciously wrote that for us, and he held the first ever Indigenous Prime Ministerial Conference in 2004 that Métis leader Audrey Patra attended as a representative of the Métis National Council, and Phil Fontaine with the First Nations, and Inuit leader Josie Kusiguk. But let's jump ahead a little bit, because some rather interesting occurrences have come up more recently, and Bill C-92 was passed in 2019, and it was to recognize Indigenous rights over Child and Family Services in an actual governing way. And this has a direct bearing on C-53, which we'll talk about in a minute. And just in recent days, the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously decided to overrule a constitutional challenge, saying, no, this is going to go ahead. And it's been in all the news. It's been quite high profile. Of course, some would argue maybe this is the opposite extreme of the legacy of residential schools. Without getting into the minute details, which we talked about with Jason Madden, well, what are your thoughts about how much attention this is getting and what the significance of it is?
It's very important on two counts. The first is for what it means in itself. And I talked earlier about, for a long time in Canadian history, there's this maternal or paternal view towards Indigenous people. This marks, in fact, the law saying that's not going to work anymore. Like, you have to recognize that these are people who are capable of doing it themselves, and all the implications that are attached to it. And, the very fact that this now comes up within and is accepted is in attitudinal terms, it's very important too, because it causes people to have to stop and say, I got to put away a lot of those old presumptions that I had for years. I mean, here's how it's going to be, and standing up. It's a recognition, again, I said earlier, rights are rights are rights, except that has not always been the case in resolving, treaties that have not been abided by or otherwise. Now the law is coming up and looking back and saying, under the principles of Canadian law, the underlying principles, this is the way that it should be. So it's a very key step.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting? Just we seem to notice this quite often, and the Métis have noticed it historically. But they had to go to court over and over again. And I don't know how familiar you'd be with the cases like the Powley case, which was about harvesting rights actually in the Sault Ste. Marie area, the Daniels case, which was about the idea that someone needs to recognize the Métis. Someone needs to be able to take the responsibility for negotiating with the Métis. And the Daniels case decided, I think that was 2019 as well, that it's going to have to be, it's going to be the federal government. I'm curious, Anthony, about your thoughts about, this, there's the legislative arm and then there's the judicial, why do we have to be going to the court, the Supreme Court, of all courts, to get these things resolved where they have to sort of tell Parliament, this is what we think you meant, and this is the way it's going to be?
Short answer, David, is it's very convenient. It's a convenient way for politicians to deal with it because, there's the difference between doing what is morally right and doing what is politically popular. And of course, the two are not always the same thing. So sometimes you're confronted with something where you look and say, I know I should do this, but my polls telling me 40% of the Canadian population, my supporters, are going to hate it. So what am I going to do here? Well, the easy answer, and in many ways the proper answer, is to say, okay, let's kick it over to the courts and let them decide. Because even if you actually make a decision without consulting the courts, you may well make an unpopular decision. Somebody then challenges it in court. The decision gets overturned and you've lost twice. So, courts are a pretty good place for final resolution, though.
So I guess you're saying that it's a good thing that judges don't need to get elected or reelected.
Yeah, it is. And
is that just a Canadian thing?
That's a very key distinction of the U.S., where in fact, like a judge might run on something, say, hey, I'm going to be, I'm going to be Mr. Tough Guy on this issue, and I'm going to make sure that you get to keep, no hunting rights on your country place or something like that.
This is really off topic, but maybe not so much when it comes to, the autonomy of the judicial, because in the United States, only just yesterday, a judge in Nevada, let this so-called whistleblower out of jail who is making comments about the Biden family's involvement in Ukraine and payoffs. The Republicans are dining out on this, and now it's all turning out to be not true because they want to impeach a president over it. And I'm not saying this is the case with this particular judge, but you have to sit to wonder, and they always report this in American media, who appointed said judge? Was it a Republican or was it a Democrat?
And the Canadian system has stepped away from that, which is very good. Sometimes, the funny thing is that the American system of everybody running and getting elected feels from the outside like it's the right way to go, except it isn't. And the Canadian way, which is the Prime Minister essentially decides with advice from some other people, seems like the wrong way in a partisan way, except, the funny thing is it works in fact, but not in theory. In general, our courts have been very, very even-handed, as opposed to cases in the U.S. where you look at the Supreme Court, you look at other ones, and say, well, now they're conservative, now they're liberal. In ours, you can generally look and say, well, they're going to listen to it, they're going to make a decision based on the facts.
So, on that point, I think about getting back to the political side. You were talking about, what's politically expedient, as opposed to what the law, how it should actually be interpreted. We'll let the courts decide that. Prime Minister Trudeau, and now I'm talking about Justin Trudeau, after he was elected, a lot of progress has been made relative to negotiations with Indigenous peoples and with the Métis and in the Inuit. I mean, only just the other day, I think this might have started in the Harper years, but Trudeau was up north. I forget exactly the details, but it was basically saying, yes, this is going to be a jurisdiction of Inuit authority in the north. A huge swath of Canadian land base. I mean, just absolutely remarkable. And it was Trudeau who, I believe, said, we want the call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission asking for the Pope to come to Canada to apologize for residential schools. We want that to occur. And who thought that would occur? And it has actually come about. So talk a little bit about, we're going to talk about Bill C-53, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the political aspect, the Métis feel like not a lot happened during the Harper years. Now they're trying to get this legislation through during the so-called Trudeau years. Pierre Poilievre, according to my colleague in Ottawa, my neighbor actually, Nick Nanos, and Nanos on the numbers, is telling us that Pierre Poilievre is over 40%. And only just this morning, he was there talking French again. And when the Conservative leader goes into Quebec and he's not from Quebec and he starts speaking French and he's getting questions in French and he's actually answering them in a coherent way, that if you're a Liberal Prime Minister, you might be in trouble. So talk a little bit about the political aspect of this. Like, does this legislation have to get through if there's going to be an election in 2025? Does it have to happen now, or maybe all bets are off?
Well, the Conservative record is pretty good in the sense they started the Truth and Reconciliation. Mr. Harper was, as an Albertan, was very aware of implications of it. He was also sort of a very cautious, like he liked everything measured and detailed before, and that defined it. But he got that going. But to your underlying question, David, on this, there's the great saying by the old late American politician Tip O'Neill that said, all politics is local. And what that means, of course, is that everybody's kind of in favor of greater rights and greater something for everybody else until it's in your backyard. And when it gets into your backyard, meaning all of a sudden you own a cottage in the weekend, an hour out of whatever city you're in, and all of a sudden now there are Indigenous, hunting rights on your property. So you've been in favor of it until it's literally in your backyard, and now you don't like it that much. Never mind that there's 400 or 500 years of established tradition. It's going to be in your way. Or you're a business person looking to develop natural resources, and the courts say, well, actually, before you do that, you have a duty to consult on this, and you have to get, agreement from the First Nations involved. Or it's a big swath of land that a developer wants to do something with, and they're going to build however many houses at a time of housing shortage. And again, the courts say, well, yeah, but actually that's part of the ancestral lands of something else. These are things where people are going to find themselves, and very, very seldom do people actually say, okay, that's the right thing, but I know I'm to do, but I know I'm against it. There's always a different rationalization, right? But this is the kind of stuff that we're going to confront. And that's why you see the courts are getting involved.
Yes, and you make me think about what happens when people actually go to the polls, which are effectively unanimous. It's when they vote that you sort of kind of find out what people really feel about something. And I guess that's both that's what's delicate about democracy, and it's also what's beautiful about democracy. So for C-53, this is legislation that has now come out of committee, gone to third reading. There's been a certain amount of controversy over it, particularly in Ontario, over what constitutes areas of Métis habitation. But that's not what the legislation says, which is what the Métis argument is. This legislation applies to Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Alberta in particular, and it talks about governing, self-government, and having governments that are Métis, for the Métis, particularly with family child services, somewhat quite similar to C-92. You're very learned, you read every day, you keep up on the media. What are your thoughts about this legislation? How do you think it's going, and what, if anything, do you feel about its prospects as it tries to go back in through the process?
Well, first on the issue of polls, polls are funny on these issues because, and you mentioned Nick Nanos earlier, there's not a lot of better pollsters, or people for that matter, than Nick, who's a lovely guy and terrific at his job. The problem is with polls a lot of the time, on some particular issues, is people will lie. So it's a very well-established principle, for example, that, if you ask people in the U.S., in some parts of the U.S., do you like Donald Trump? And the answer is no, because they feel that they should probably say, no, I don't. And then they get into the polling booth and they say, yeah, actually, I'm not telling anybody I'm going to vote for him. In Quebec for years, Francophones who were Federalists didn't want to admit it because it wasn't the cool thing to be. So there was always a lower percentage here. You run the same danger here that, if you say to people, are you in favor of recognizing Indigenous treaty rights and something in a way that will affect your own life? They know that the correct answer is to say, yeah, I'm for it because it's the right thing to do. But if they actually have a vote on it, or if they can in some way influence it so they preserve their existing rights, some people at least are going to say, oh, no, okay, I'm not telling anybody, but I'm not so keen on it,
Yeah, but in the House of Commons, I mean, everybody, we know who's voting, right? That's open. Sometimes there's this expression of a vote getting, whipped. The Liberals have a minority government. They have the support of the NDP. There's this agreement, depending on which article you read in the media, this on-again, off-again agreement for Trudeau being propped up by the leader of the NDP, and he wanted his dental program, he wants his health program. Where does I don't hear Singh of the NDP talk much about, and that just might be my failing, about Indigenous or about Indigenous rights, or the Métis, or C-53. You might have heard him talk somewhat about it, but do they need that support to get this through?
Well, it's the same kind of principle I was talking about applies to politicians as well, which is sometimes you look at what are the parts of the country where you control, where you have your seats, and what are the relevant issues there. So so the NDP over time, where it started as a rural party out west, has now become much more a party centered in big metropolitan areas, and often in central Canada or otherwise. It's not therefore as much of an issue at this point. So he does talk about it. He does express sympathy with the causes, but on his plate of priorities of the sound bites that he wants to get out to the general public, usually it's thinking about, what's the issue with the bigger reach that's popular? Well, that's pharmacare. There are 40 million Canadians understand the potential of pharmacare, whereas people in cities aren't. The realities are not thinking as much about Indigenous issues, or if they are, they'll say it's important, but it's not directly. Again, it's not. It's the all politics is local principle.
When you have an election in Canada, you can have all kinds of blue all over the place and maybe a lot of orange in certain jurisdictions. But when it comes to who's going to win this election, you look at the cities and you look at Toronto and you look at Winnipeg, and you can cut a line right across, the little dots, red dots right across, Calgary even, Vancouver, Victoria. And that's where the Liberals, seem to have their strength, seems to be urban.
Yeah, I think, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, I do think that we've hit a critical mass, a moment in time, which we did probably in about the late 2010s, where people started saying, this is an issue we got to do something about. And all of a sudden we saw that a lot of the rest of the world was coming here. Europe for years, Europeans have often had a greater fascination, a greater awareness, and a greater respect for Indigenous peoples, for their traditions, for their stories, for their art as well. I was good friends with the late Peter Jennings, the Canadian, but American news host, who had a wonderful collection of, for example, Inuit art, and said people in New York were fascinated by seeing this all the time and asked lots of questions. And he said, he would say, to a degree that you don't find at home in Canada. It's sort of, sometimes you have to go away for people to recognize the strengths more.
Yes, and in Alberta now, there's an internationally recognized Métis tourist destination called Métis Crossing that people can visit just outside Edmonton. Peter Jennings is from Ottawa, I believe.
Yeah.
And he just killed it on the Millennial New Year's broadcast. Was one of the best things I've ever seen. I don't know if he won an Emmy for it or not, but oh my goodness. Is it true he started off doing furniture commercials in Ottawa? Or do you
he didn't graduate. He didn't graduate high school right away. And then he was host of a sort of a youth show where they played music when he was in his early 20s. And then somebody heard that voice. And said, wow, it's kind of like a Peter Mansbridge.
Well, kind of like a Peter Mansbridge story. In Thompson, or was it Thompson, Manitoba?
Churchill, Manitoba.
Peter Mansbridge. So we talked a bit about Peter Mansbridge, and we're going to wrap up now. We've been taking a great deal of your time this morning. But my last question would be, Peter's come out recently with a book about Canada. And, just a bit more broadly, we've had you talking a great deal about Indigenous issues and Métis issues here this morning, Anthony. But what are your thoughts for Canada? I mean, just generally as an open question, we've got climate change issues, always have economic issues, we've got a huge housing issue, as well as Indigenous issues. We've got an election coming up, 2025. We've got a conservative leader who seems to be gaining all kinds of traction, but who really knows? If you talk to Nick Nanos, he'll tell you, well, you're not really going to know what's going to happen until the last 24 hours. So what are your thoughts and your prospects going forward for our country?
Well, let me take the history perspective. Since, of course, that's how I spend a lot of my days. I would say there's really 4 parts to understanding Canadian history. And if you omit any one of them, you're not doing it right. So the first is that Canada is and has always been an absolutely spectacular country for people from around the world to come to, and most people to live here and to have opportunity. The second part of that equation is we have miserably failed certain parts of the population, and that starts with Indigenous people who are not treated properly, and that's the big hole. The third part is that, if you look at any decade in Canadian history, over any generation over the years, every single decade has seen a tangible improvement in human rights, in treaty settlement, in progress moving forward. And of course, the final part to that equation is it isn't enough. It hasn't been achieved yet. Who knows when it will be achieved, and it has to keep doing better. And once you look at those elements, it's possible to say we have a really wonderful, flawed country that has all sorts of potential, but also needs to do better in the way it's operating right now.
I'm sure Peter Newman would be proud of those words. We've been talking with Anthony Wilson-Smith, CEO and President of Historica Canada. Anthony, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Dave. Absolute pleasure.